The 18th of July in the year 452 after the birth of Christ, the northern Italian city of Aquileia. A woman named Aurelia Marcella crouches in the darkness of a wine cellar beneath what was once the grandest villa in the merchant's quarter. She is 34 years old, the wife of Tribune Gaius Petronius Marcellus, who commands what remains of the garrison defending the city walls above her head. She has not seen her husband in 11 days. The last time she saw him, he kissed her forehead and told her to hide the children. He told her that if the walls fell, she should take them to the lagoons to the east. He told her that whatever happened, she must not let the Huns take her alive. Above her head, the sound of screaming has not stopped for 3 hours. Aurelia holds her 2 daughters against her chest. Flavia is 12. Tertia is 9. They stopped crying 2 days ago when the food ran out. Now they simply shake. The cellar smells of old wine and mold and something else, something that has been drifting through the streets for days. The smell of burning flesh and rotting bodies that even the thick stone walls cannot keep out. What Aurelia does not know yet is that her husband died on the walls 6 hours ago. An arrow through his throat while he directed the defense of the eastern gate. What she does not know is that the Huns breached the walls at dawn through a section that collapsed after 3 months of relentless bombardment. What she does not know is that the warriors now moving through the streets above her head are not simply looting. They are hunting. And what Aurelia Marcella absolutely does not know is what the Huns do to the wives of Roman military commanders. She does not know that there is a specific protocol, a system that has been refined over decades of conquest across the steppes and into the heart of Europe. She does not know that wives of officers are identified and separated from the general population. She does not know that what happens to them next is designed not merely to punish, but to send a message that will echo across the empire for generations. She is about to find out. The footsteps above grow closer. Aurelia hears voices speaking a language she does not understand, harsh guttural sounds that seem barely human. She hears the crash of doors being broken down. She hears the screams of neighbors she has known for years. She smells smoke from buildings that are beginning to burn. And then she hears footsteps on the stairs leading down to the cellar. Tonight, you will discover the systematic practices that the Huns employed against the families of Roman military leadership. Practices that ancient historians recorded in fragments too disturbing for most modern textbooks to include. You will learn why the wives of Roman generals and tribunes were specifically targeted and what purpose their suffering served in the broader strategy of Hunnic conquest. You will understand why the Byzantine historian Priscus, who actually visited the court of the Hun king and saw these practices firsthand, wrote that the treatment of captive Roman noblewomen was designed to break not just bodies, but entire bloodlines. And you will learn what archaeological evidence discovered in mass graves across the Balkans reveals about the scale of what happened to thousands of Roman women whose only crime was being married to men who defended the empire. If you find this content valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel. We explore the darkest corners of history that mainstream sources refuse to discuss. But before I tell you exactly what happened in that cellar beneath Aquileia, before I reveal what the Huns did to Aurelia Marcella and her daughters when they finally broke through the door, I need to take you back. I need to explain how the most feared warriors in the ancient world developed their particular methods for dealing with the wives of their enemies. Because understanding what happened in Aquileia requires understanding the system that created it. And I promise you that by the time we return to that cellar, you will understand exactly why Aurelia's husband told her that death was preferable to capture. Let me tell you about another woman first. Her name was Licinia Eudoxia. She was not a victim of the Huns, but her story illustrates what Roman women faced during this era of collapse. She was the daughter of the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II, and she was married to the Western Emperor Valentinian III. When Valentinian was assassinated in 455, she was taken as a prize by Vandal raiders who sacked Rome itself. She spent years in captivity before being released. Her story was famous. It was discussed in the courts of Constantinople, but the thousands of women taken by the Huns, their stories were not famous. Their stories were not discussed. They simply disappeared into the vastness of the steppes and were never heard from again. The Huns emerged from the Central Asian steppes sometime in the 4th century after the birth of Christ. Their origins remain disputed among historians, but what is not disputed is the terror they inspired from the moment they crossed into Europe. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the 370s, described them as a race of men who surpassed all other barbarians in their savagery. He wrote that they were short and squat with massive shoulders and thick necks. that their faces were so hideous and beardless that they might be mistaken for two-legged beasts rather than human beings. But Ammianus was describing more than physical appearance. He was describing a culture of warfare that the Romans had never encountered. The Huns were nomadic horse warriors who lived in the saddle from childhood. They could shoot their composite bows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. They ate raw meat that they tenderized by placing it between their thighs and their horses' flanks. They had no permanent settlements and no written language. And most importantly for our story, they had developed sophisticated methods for extracting maximum value from conquered peoples. This is where the wives of military commanders become relevant. But first, you need to understand something about Hunnic society that most histories do not emphasize. The Huns were not simply raiders, they were empire builders. By the time of Attila, they controlled territory stretching from the Rhine River in the west to the Ural Mountains in the east. They ruled over dozens of subject peoples, including Goths, Gepids, Alans, and remnants of earlier nomadic confederations. They extracted tribute from both the Eastern and Western Roman empires. At the height of their power, they received 2,100 pounds of gold annually from Constantinople alone. An empire of this scale required more than military force. It required systems. Systems for extracting wealth, systems for controlling subject populations, systems for breaking the will of conquered peoples so completely that rebellion became unthinkable. The treatment of captured women was part of this system. Among nomadic warrior cultures like the Huns, women of the enemy leadership class served multiple purposes. They were trophies that demonstrated victory. They were hostages whose treatment could be used to demoralize remaining resistance. They were breeding stock whose children would carry the bloodline of the conquerors. And they were objects of trade whose value depended on their social status and physical condition. The Byzantine historian Priscus provides the most detailed first-hand account of Hunnic society. In the year 449, he traveled to the court of the Hun king as part of a diplomatic mission from Constantinople. What he saw there changed his understanding of the barbarian world forever. Priscus describes meeting a Greek merchant who had been captured during the sack of the city of Viminatium on the Danube. This merchant had been wealthy before his capture. He had been assigned to a Hun noble named Onegesius as part of the division of spoils. Priscus notes that among the Huns it was customary for wealthy captives to be given to the nobility, while common prisoners were distributed among the warriors or sold as slaves. But Priscus also describes something more disturbing. He writes about the way Hun elites treated their slaves and captives. He notes that unlike Roman masters who were legally prohibited from killing their slaves without cause, the Huns had no such restrictions. Hun nobles could and did execute captives for minor offenses or simply for entertainment. They could and did use female captives in whatever manner they chose. Priscus records a conversation he had with the Greek merchant about the differences between Roman and Hunnic slavery. The merchant who had adapted to life among the Huns initially argued that captives were treated better than poor citizens of the Roman Empire. He claimed that Hun masters were more generous than Roman tax collectors. He claimed that life on the steppes had a freedom that life in the declining empire could not match. But when Priscus pressed him, the merchant admitted certain truths. He admitted that Hun masters could kill their slaves without consequence. He admitted that female captives had no legal protections whatsoever. He admitted that the children of captive women belonged entirely to their masters with no recognition of Roman paternity or citizenship. And then the merchant wept. He wept because despite his accommodation to Hunnic life, he knew what had happened to the Roman women he had seen taken during the sack of Viminatium. He knew what had happened to their children. He knew that the fate of captive noblewomen was something he could not speak of even after years among the Huns. The treatment of elite Roman women was particularly brutal because it served a strategic purpose. The Huns understood something fundamental about Roman society. Roman military commanders drew their authority not just from their office, but from their family name and lineage. A tribune or general whose wife and daughters had been violated and enslaved lost not just his family, but his honor. His ability to command respect among his peers was destroyed. His bloodline was corrupted. This was intentional. The first major Hun invasion of Roman territory came in the year 441, when the kings Attila and Bleda launched a massive assault across the Danube into the provinces of Illyricum. The Eastern Roman Empire had sent its best troops to North Africa to fight the Vandals, leaving the Danubian frontier virtually undefended. The Huns recognized this weakness and exploited it with devastating efficiency. The invasion was not a simple raid. It was a calculated campaign designed to extract maximum concessions from the Eastern Empire. Attila and Bleda used the pretext of unpaid tribute and unfulfilled treaty obligations to justify their attack. They claimed that Roman authorities were harboring Hunnic deserters. They claimed that a Roman bishop had desecrated Hunnic burial sites. Whether these claims were true was irrelevant. They provided the justification for an assault that had been planned for months. They captured and destroyed the city of Singidunum, which is now Belgrade. The garrison there numbered approximately 3,000 men. None survived. The civilian population numbered perhaps 15,000. Those who were not killed were taken as slaves. The families of the garrison officers were separated and processed according to the Hunnic system. They moved on to Margus and razed it to the ground. The bishop of Margus, the very man the Huns had accused of tomb desecration, was handed over to them by his own congregation, who hoped this sacrifice might spare their city. It did not. Margus was destroyed as thoroughly as Singidunum. The bishop's fate was recorded in fragments that suggest he was impaled on the walls of his own cathedral. They drove deep into the Balkans, taking city after city, and at each conquest they followed the same pattern. The fighting men were killed or enslaved. The common women and children were taken as general captives to be distributed among the warriors, but the wives and daughters of military officers and civic leaders were separated and given special treatment. The city of Naissus provides the most horrifying example of this system in action. Naissus was the birthplace of Constantine the Great, the emperor who had legalized Christianity and transformed the Roman world. It was a major military center and administrative hub in the province of Dacia Mediterranea. The city had walls that had been strengthened under multiple emperors. It had granaries that could sustain a siege for months. It had a garrison of veteran troops and a civilian militia prepared to defend their homes. When the Huns arrived in 443, they found a city that would not surrender. The siege began in early spring. The Huns deployed battering rams and siege towers technologies they had learned from conquered peoples over decades of expansion. They also deployed a weapon that the Romans had not anticipated: terror. Every day of the siege, the Huns executed captives taken from the surrounding countryside within sight of the walls. They impaled farmers. They burned villages. They sent the severed heads of Roman soldiers flying over the walls by catapult. They wanted the defenders to know exactly what awaited them if they did not surrender. The defenders did not surrender. They held for weeks as their food supplies dwindled and disease began to spread. They held as the Huns brought up more siege equipment and began systematic bombardment of the walls. They held until they could hold no longer. When the walls finally fell, the Huns unleashed what the historian Callinicus called a slaughter beyond counting. The same Callinicus wrote that the barbarian nation of the Huns, which was in Thrace, became so great that more than 100 cities were captured, and there were so many murders and bloodlettings that the dead could not be numbered. He wrote that they took captive the churches and monasteries and slew the monks and maidens in great quantities. But what happened to the families of the officers who defended Naissus was recorded in fragments that survive only because later historians found them too significant to ignore entirely. The commander of the Naissus garrison was a man whose name has been lost to history. We know him only as the Comus Nicenis, the Count of Naissus. We know that his wife was captured alive along with their 3 daughters whose ages are recorded as 14, 11, and 8. We know that they were identified by servants who betrayed their hiding place in exchange for their own lives. What happened next was documented by Priscus, who passed through the ruins of Naissus 5 years after its destruction. He wrote that when they arrived at Naissus, they found the city deserted, as though it had been sacked. Only a few sick persons lay in the churches. He wrote that they halted at a short distance from the river in an open space because all the ground adjacent to the bank was full of the bones of men slain in war. But Priscus also recorded testimony from survivors who had witnessed the fate of the commander's family. The wife of the Comes was brought before the Hun nobles who had led the assault. She was stripped of her Roman clothing, which was valuable and could be sold or traded. She was examined by Hun women who served as assessors, determining the value of female captives based on